Yeah, good afternoon, Pat. Thank you again for taking the time to speak with me for this storytelling project today. How are you doing?
Hi, good. Thank you for involving me in the project, Bruce.
Absolutely. So, the thing we start off all the interviews with is just asking, how long have you lived in LO?
Well, I lived in Lake Oswego for 23 years. Um, Many people had suggested that I move here. I think most of the people who suggested it were maybe white, and maybe Willie Poinsette. But yeah, mostly for the schools. I think people were suggesting I move here.
Yeah, so where were you living before?
Before I moved here, my family was living in Northeast Portland, out in the Park Rose area. And at that time, my sons were attending a private school. And so I really had wanted them to attend a public school where they could walk to school and also have neighborhood friends to play with.
Mhm. And how would you compare Parkrose, because this would have been 20 some odd years ago, with LO?
Yeah, I think the difference is we knew the obstacles when we were moving to Lake Oswego with the connotations um, of Lake No Negro and not being as inclusive for people of color. Um, so it really took quite a bit of conversation in our family about that. Um, and I would say that when we moved here, I think the neighborhood that we lived in was more relaxed, more inclusive, not as competitive, like financially, I think, needing to one up each other. Um, and so moving here was certainly different, being in a more white community. And so that was more, I think, the things that we saw, the disparities around the finance and, having less color in the neighborhood, people of color. So we kind of chose to move towards like Oak Creek area, knowing that that area had a larger Asian population than the other schools. So that's why we had selected the Oak Creek area.
Yeah, and to that end, how would you say LO has changed over the years, especially when it comes to race and race relations, and in what ways has it stayed the same?
Um, I think like Oswego, as I worked with the school district, and I think I really did see that within the school district, um, people of color who were working or were living in the school district, things were different. Um, and then again, some things are the same. Things haven't seemed to change much. I think that the community has had more education around diversity, inclusion, and equity, but I'm not really sure how much it really gets practiced. Um, I think it's more of a conversation and moving the needle to actually practice it. Um, you know, to practice it well and do it comfortably is still in the process of happening. Um, so, I mean, I still think they're doing quite a bit of work, even though they're having lots of DEI meetings and conversations. I just think that they still have much more work to do for the
No.
most part.
Yeah, to that point, speaking of just working in the schools, because obviously, I was the former student, and one of the things I noticed a lot was, as far as like fellow, students of color, is definitely, people would be here for a little bit, and then, you know, most people don't stay in the LO programs, you know, for a variety of reasons. But I guess, like, would you say that's kind of a similar thing you've seen from, you know, just from like the professional standpoint and working in the district?
Yeah, I think you still hear the same stories. I mean, I've been here 20 years, over 20 years. The stories are still the same that I hear. People are working here, then they feel like there's some, you know, racial issues going on, and then they leave because of the pressures. I have before hired a staff who was very excellent. I actually recruited him to work in our district. The parents and the students really loved him, but because he was Black and had dreads and had to catch the bus across the street of the school, people were always calling the police on him. So at some point he, you know, had to tell me that he really couldn't work here anymore because he was so concerned about his safety. Well, that was such a loss to the community because of those kinds of non-inclusive behaviors. So those stories, I think I still hear them today. I still hear stories about families who move into the neighborhood and just feel a lot of, you know, racial pressures in their neighborhood, and then also leave as well. So that is really discouraging. You know, I know that the city is really trying to move the needle, finally doing much more cultural events. I mean, when you compare it to Portland, I mean, they're just starting that like within these past 2 years. You know, and Portland's been doing it for, I mean, who can even count when they started doing more multicultural events and honoring other communities of color. So in some ways, you know, Lake Oswego is still really catching up, but they're catching up, I think, under some pressure from people in the community. And so we still have to move the needle, even though it's very small. But it's encouraging, but we still have to do work. But even, I mean, just these last few months, we, you know, respond to racism, being involved in respond to racism, we are still getting messages about racial incidents, students needing help, and then maybe the school district not taking it very seriously as on the impact of the students. So we're still working on that, hopefully working more with the school district and supporting parents in that area.
I definitely want to get to your involvement with respond to racism, but just before we go there, you just talk a little bit more about just how you know, personally dealt with a lot, like those pressures that come, like you talk about, you know, hiring someone and, you know, being in that position to try and like bring in more people, because it feels like on one hand you have to deal with administration or, you know, the district and powers that be in that end, and then also there's to be like some element of, you know, again, just dealing with people, you know, in the community or bringing in people to, you know, work in the district, or now in this case sort of like with respond also, you know, volunteer in the district. And it feels like just as I assume just sort of like a pressure on both ends that probably I imagine has to be a lot to deal with at times. Can you just talk about that a little bit?
Yes, it's quite an uphill battle. I mean, of course, the first hurdle was already moving into the school district. I mean, the plan had been to move into the school district, like I said, so my sons could really have a good education, because that's what the schools were known for. But in that environment, you know, there was a lot of pressure, a lot of bullying, a lot of the, you know, they can't snitch on friends, right? Things like that. So, and then knowing that they had to navigate through the system as children of color, right? I could kind of hear that. So I did make the decision then to, even though I was working in the Portland public school system, then I chose to work in the Lake Oswego school district. Knowing that that was going to be a huge challenge for me, being a woman of color, and then the job that I do. I work in special education, and my job is to work supporting staff, my special education staff, to support students, and then also more so to work in very contentious meetings. And contentious meetings meaning that the community that was going to be coming to the table were, affluent, white, majority. So I knew that. So I knew it was going to be a challenge, but I thought, well, I'll step forward and do that because I really need to, as a person of color, as a role model, and then also, I just felt like it was very important. So as far as like hiring, so in my role as an educator here, then I really tried to make sure that if we hired people of color, or even if, within the community, that I did give them, extra support, spent more time with them spent more time with them for support in the community because it's much needed. And then also when working with families of color in our special education meetings, I also did put in some different kind of time with them. I really spent the time to build more relationships because it's different when you're a family of color coming into the community, and with the whole process of special education and going through all of the legal processes around that paperwork, you don't have time to build relationships. And I think sometimes the process was too fast and too abrupt for people of color. So I felt it was very important to build those relationships and explain my role, and that was there to work with them. And I found that very, very important. And I really had to explain that to my colleagues who were not of color, as they were wondering why I was just doing all this extra work, and they could not see the importance of that I was doing that work because I was helping them build their relationship with the family. But I guess, not until after I have been more involved with Respond to Racism that I didn't realize the extra work that I was doing that kind of followed my values and the work that I was doing as I'm able to step back.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting you say that. So it sounds like I would assume then the district didn't provide you, they weren't paying you extra, providing you extra support for doing this. And it's, I was reading a report on this. It was about higher education, but it kind of described a similar phenomenon where it's like an extra tax on people of color working in these spaces just to kind of like do that relationship building work that you described. So yeah, that does bring me to Respond, because would you say that, just like those experiences with your children going through the system, and obviously, the relationship with, my mother, Willie, I imagine, but would you say that kind of like motivated you to get involved with RtR? And can you just talk about, how you got involved and the role very many roles you've been playing since then?
Okay, well, I got hoodwinked into RtR. Actually, I had already retired from the school district. And then was really, I know people that I had worked with when I said I was going to retire and didn't have a plan. They all laughed because they knew that I was probably going to be doing some other task and then really jumping in full-fledged doing that. And at that time, I had really planned on moving back to Hawaii, where I grew up, really kind of missing that community of color, being immersed in it, and kind of giving back to my community. So that was actually my initial plan. Then I ran into your mom, who was, of course, she's the president and founder of Respond to Racism. And then she asked me to work with her. And I was a little hesitant because I know that if I'm going to work with Miss Willie Poinsette, from having worked with her 35 years ago, I knew that I would have to really work very hard, and her expectations are very high, and I'd have to really jump that hurdle. And then I knew myself that once I committed to something, that I would work very hard. So yeah, so I was mostly a greeter at the meetings that you guys were hosting at the United Church of Christ. And, you know, I know that Willie had always wanted me to do more work, but in just the involvement of being on the leadership team and the early parts that I participated in, I realized that I was doing much of my internal work at that time. So I think unable to participate verbally as much because I had so much inner work to do. I think as an Asian woman, the culture is not to really, rock the boat, really being the model minority, being quiet. I mean, not that I didn't do that at work, but at work I had learned to be real assertive. So people appreciated that, but it's just as a general personality, that is not my personality. So I was doing, I think, a lot of inner work at that time. And then also still reeling from the work with the school district, because that had been very rough work. So I had been internally working through all of that through the Respond to Racism community meetings. So I think that was very helpful. All the discussions and opportunities for conversation was very helpful. And so now I'm in charge of the community meetings, doing the planning, and that has been very exciting to be working and more with the community. And so I appreciate that involvement. And then of course, Willie wanted me to apply for the DEI position for the city, the DEI board. So I'm doing that. I'm extra busy doing that, but it's very helpful. I think the blend of Respond to Racism and then working with the city in that capacity of advisory, as far as the advisory board, has been very helpful. I think it's a good blend. And I know Respond to Racism has started or encouraged and influenced the city and school district to really practice more DEI processes, but there's still work around that area, and it just seems to having to maintain that momentum of honoring DEI, I think, in those systems is still lots of work. It's not a natural thing for the community.
And you mentioned earlier just growing up in Hawaii and having that sense of actually being immersed in community. As far as are there places in LO where you can go, or activities in LO where you can go for some form of that? And
I think in LO, I think if you think of a natural place that you can be more involved in places of color, there isn't a natural place, I think, because people are hesitant to be more involved because of the pressures. So I think everything is pretty siloed, like the Asian community is pretty siloed and they do their own thing. So it's siloed and not as inclusive as in the full community. So, and I think the students feel that as well. As I recall, when there was lots of or still is, that Asian hate going on around COVID, and we had done a silent walk for the Asian community, and the youth were very surprised at the support that they had in the community around that. And that just kind of broke my heart, thinking here we had to organize something for them to feel that the community even cared. So it's not a natural thing for the students to feel like, they're being honored or cared or respected. But hats off to those students, because since they felt so much support, I mean, they started their Asian American Student Union right after that, and then had a wonderful celebration just this past April, with a super high support, very successful event. And so I was very proud and pleased of them.
And, speaking of the students, you kind of talked a little bit about your son's experiences earlier, but can you just, talk a little bit more about kind of like what types of things they had to deal with kind of going through the LO school system, and if you're at the liberty to share just, how they've kind of, it's like both how you and they've kind of like processed all that.
So I think, when I was working in Portland Public Schools and kind of hearing some of the things that, my sons were going through, that's why I thought I'd go ahead and work and come here and work if the possibility arose. That way I could have my ears to the ground, learn the culture of the school better, inside and out, and just having a better handle of that, just so I knew what my sons were going through, and then also helping them navigate mostly through the school system as things would come up. Because if they would ask, oh, this is happening with a teacher or whatever, and I'd say, well, this is probably what's going to happen. So it just kind of help guide them to that. Even though sometimes I really believe that my children are right, because they were maybe felt like they had been, like their value had been overlooked, and they weren't being treated fairly. And I certainly would honor that in our conversations, but telling them that, when they went to the teacher, this is probably what was going to happen instead. So those things were, I think, difficult for them growing up in the community.
Are there any particular stories that, stick out to you?
I think when the children were young, like maybe some of their friends would get teased, and then they would come home very upset because maybe it was, like some racial teasing, and then not knowing how to kind of manage that kind of scenarios. And so I think, my older son, as you know him, Joe, he played a lot of soccer. So I think his way of really kind of detaching from the community was being in club soccer and building relationships outside of the school, right? So so that's where really his friends were. They were not in the school system. My younger son, Jordan, did spend more time within the school. He started a little bit younger, but most of his friends were children of color. And so I think that was a little bit easier for him. But, if you ask both of them, would you come back for a high school reunion? The answer would probably strongly be probably a no. In this case, unlike the community I grew up in, I'm at every class reunion because it was a different kind of experience. And I'm still very close with my high school friends. I mean, they still come here and visit. We still get together. Uh, so, and of course, all my friends are people of color. So it's just very different, which is why I think I really made sure when my sons were growing up that we spent a lot of time in Hawaii so that they could really experience like that culture that's very forgiving, very loving, a very tight community. So I think that has had lots of influence, in their lives as well, being, young men right now.
Yeah, so we've covered a good amount of ground here today, but is there anything, I guess, like, first off, just going forward, you've talked about how the conversation, people are being a little bit more, they're having more of these conversations in LO, and they're doing some DEI work. But in terms of, where you'd like to see things go going forward, and I guess like areas to really like focus on, improve, what would you say, where would you like to see this work go, in the immediate future?
I really would like to see, of course, more diversity in all the aspects of, just in the community. And when I say aspects, I mean in like city positions, in positions where you can really make impact on the community, as opposed to people of color just being comfortable in their silos, which is really unfortunate, I think. So hopefully, that can happen as we're having more events and people are coming out to celebrate other cultures. I think that's very important. I think we get lots of feedback after those events about, how people are feeling very positively. So that's been very helpful. So really, how, the question for me is, how do you continue to strengthen the BIPOC community? And at some point also, it has to start in schools. The youth are still having the same issues, as when my sons and when you were in school, about the diversity of the curriculum. So, that is quite a challenge, I think, still. So hoping that the curriculum is more diverse, not just honoring, oh, this is, AAPI month. Why can't it just be all year? That month can be a special month, but certainly you can, honor AAPI and Black History Month all year. It doesn't, you can't do it in just that month, but it should be really embedded in the curriculum. And I know there's like a timeline of when that has to be done is required by the state, but if LO wants to be a leading model school district, it certainly should be embedded, sooner than later, not until 2025, whenever that deadline is by the state. And then, hopefully, I would like to see more respect for all the cultures. I think sometimes, even when I'm working in the yard, I think like if people are driving by, do they wave or do they think I'm the gardener? Sometimes I wonder about that, because you just kind of get a look. So, well, because maybe most people around me are hiring gardeners and then I'm doing my own yard work. So they may just think I'm the hired help. So I still kind of get that feeling around that, even though I've lived for 20 years. Of course, my neighbors know that, that I live here, but sometimes I just not sure about when people are driving by. So I still get that feeling.
Oh, Pat, thank you again for taking the time this afternoon. Is there anything before we hop off? Is there anything else you'd like to add, or anything you think we didn't cover that should be included?
No, I really appreciate you taking the time, Bruce, to do this work, getting stories from the elders. I don't know how I qualify for the elders, probably not for like another year or so. So I think of the elders as being like wise elders. So I feel very fortunate, Bruce, and I really appreciate being active and Respond to Racism organization, as it has helped me internally, and then I can continue to do the work in this community. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I hope that the community makes more progress. I think it is some days, and then sometimes not. But I have to be hopeful. I have to be hopeful, yeah. And then my sons are knowing, growing up here, they're pleased that I'm involved in doing the work here.
That's good.
Yeah, so they know.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your day.
Okay, thank you.